Here's exactly how to manage a construction project from start to finish so you actually make money. There's 3 principles that underpin this, and they actually contradict each other. Number 1 is influence. Your ability to shape the outcomes of the project drastically reduce over time. Decisions you make in the first 2 weeks of the project matter much more than anything you'll do in the last 2 months. Number 2 is uncertainty. At the start of the project, you know the least and there's the most unknowns. Ground conditions, weather, scope gaps, they all matter and they all reveal themselves throughout the execution of the project. And number 3 is the chaos compound. Something as simple as a missed note on a drawing can seem like nothing at the start of the job, but by the end of the job, it can be a $50,000 to $100,000 problem. Fixed price contracts, 10% margins, uncertainty that we're responsible for, not to mention technically complex scopes and an ethical responsibility to deliver projects in a way that nobody gets hurt means there is not much room for error when executing a construction project. So here's a simple framework you can use to effectively manage and deliver a construction project built around the 4 fundamental phases: bidding, pre-construction, construction, and closeout. This process kicks off with you receiving a set of tender documents from your client. It'll have a scope of works, maybe a draft form of contract, and a set of construction drawings. And surprise, surprise, the first step in the process is to simply work out what they've sent you and what they're actually asking you to price. At this point in time, you're spending your own money to try and secure the project. So you don't have unlimited resources to go through. You want to be relatively efficient and effective and with how you price it. The goal here is to take the set of bid documents that they've sent you and to transfer that into a signed contract with a price and terms and conditions where you can reliably make money. Now, the biggest risk here isn't winning the project or not winning the project, it's winning the project at a price you can make money. If you underquote, you don't clearly articulate your terms and conditions, there's misinterpretations, scope gaps, you can end up very easily losing money on the project. We all know construction is a highly commoditized industry and often pricing is a race to the bottom. So the biggest risk here isn't not winning the project, it's winning the project and losing money in construction. So the first step in securing the project is to simply understand the bid documents. I always start with the scope of works before I move on to the drawings. Because the drawings, they show you the overall project. You may not necessarily be contracted for everything, so it's important to understand the actual scope of works and what your client is asking you to price. You want to develop some sort of understanding of the project overview, the high-level scope, the key inclusions and exclusions, and particularly any unusual requirements, because these are the things that often get missed and confused. I like to take all the bid documents and turn them into a structured set of requirements. All the requirements in the tender documents that will eventually have some impact on price. Now, 99% of the time, the documents your clients send you will probably be confusing and contradictory. So the other thing you have to do right away is to go through the documents and develop a list of questions and clarifications and get them back to your client as soon as possible. There will always be unclear and ambiguous requirements, and you should ask those as soon as possible. You also want to get a feeling for the key risks and opportunities. Where is the uncertainty that matters? Where can it translate poorly for you, i.e. become a risk, and where is it an opportunity to profit during construction? Once you've developed a firm understanding of the project scope, you can move on to preparing your estimate. The first step in preparing an estimate is to generate a pricing schedule. Now, I'm showcasing this in my estimating and contract management software Opera, but all the features I'm showing you are completely free to use. So feel free to try them out and see if you like them. Otherwise, you can do similar things with Excel and just standard templates. Now, a pricing schedule has 2 key roles. It is a way of breaking up the project scope so you can ensure you're pricing every single activity that needs to be included in your quote. The second thing it does is it helps to articulate and explain your price to the client. The more detail you can show on your pricing schedule, the easier it is going to be to understand what's included and excluded and reduce the chances of disputes later on. Once you've got a comprehensive pricing schedule that lists out every activity in your project scope, you can begin doing your detailed pricing. For each activity, you need to build up the labor, plant, materials, and subcontract costs required to complete the task. Fundamentally, this is always going to be a multiplication of a quantity multiplied by a rate. So for example, this is a concrete slab with 2,500 meters cubed of concrete. we have our quantity of concrete and our quantity of formwork to do the task. Then we have some combination of labor, plant, and materials. Now, obviously, you might not be doing concrete, you might be doing earthworks, so you'll have separate variables, but fundamentally, it's always just going to come down to this combination of labor, plant, materials, and subcontract resources. Now, if you're a predominantly subcontract construction business, this is when you start to engage with your supply chain. You'll have packages that you issue to the market. For each package, you should be getting 3 to 5 quotes from qualified subcontractors who you would be happy to actually do the project. Again, in the same way that you need to clearly articulate your price to your client, you should be clearly articulating to your subcontractors exactly what you want them to quote. You do this with clear bid documents that specify exactly what you want them to price, a bill of quantities and a pricing schedule that shows how you want their scope breaking down. And then when you're getting quotes from separate subcontractors, you're then comparing their prices and adjusting for any exclusions, because everyone, when they price works, excludes certain things. So when you're comparing different subcontract costs, you always need to be paying particular attention to what they've excluded. My philosophy is very simple, that every requirement in the client's bid documents needs to fall into one of 3 buckets. It needs to be covered in your direct costs, so your labor, plant, material, subcontract costs, or it needs to be covered in your preliminary cost, risk and opportunity, or you need to explicitly exclude it in your submission to the client and say that you have not factored that into your bid and you are not including that work in your offer. That's why when you finish preparing your price, you should submit your quotes in a detailed letter of offer or a submission that clearly shows your inclusions and your exclusions. Again, addressing every requirement in the client's bid documents. Now, you probably won't have priced every single requirement in your client's bid documents, but at this point in time, you submitted a price with clear inclusions and exclusions. And now, if your client is interested in your offer, you'll go through some cycle of negotiating and signing the contract. When you're negotiating a contract, my rule of thumb is relatively simple, that, again, with a baseline of always wanting to maintain your entitlement, so you're only offering to do a project you can actually make money on, you simply negotiate your price and your terms and conditions in the contract based on what risks you're happy to accept. And if you're accepting additional risk, you're accepting additional scope, you always have to adjust your price to reflect that. So to give you an example, say in your initial letter of offer submission, you excluded any allowance for liquidated damages, but your client tells you for you to do the project, you have to accept liquidated damages. There is a cost associated with that change in scope. Maybe you have to allow for additional risk, money to potentially pay the LDs. Maybe you need a cap of 10% on those liquidated damages, or maybe because they want tight notice periods in the contract, you need to allow for 10 hours per week of a contract administrator to prepare notices. The key is you're not just blindly accepting the contract terms that are thrown at you, but you're going through and systematically reviewing them and negotiating with them. And if you can, assuming you have flexibility to adjust your price, if you're taking on additional risk, you should always be compensated for it financially. Now, we have to remember at the start of the project, we are here in our influence and outcome chart. We have huge influence over the outcome of the project, but we always have to remember we have uncertain information. We can also walk away from the project with 0 repercussions. So we have to be hyper aware of what we don't know. That's why my view is any submissions you make, you should qualify aggressively, clearly, and articulate what is included and excluded in your offer. Because clearly defined scope, to me, is the key to success in construction. Once we've signed a contract, we move into the pre-construction phase. At this point in time, we have made a commitment to the client to deliver the project scope as defined in the contract, and our client has made a commitment to pay us. Theoretically, we can start billing the client for our work. Our client commitment secured, we are now spending against the project budget or the revenue we're going to receive from the client. Now, the key thing to note here with cash flow is at the start of the job is likely when your project will be most cash negative. So yes, theoretically, we have a commitment from the client, but at the start of the job, we'll be spending our own money. So we have to pay particular attention to cash flow. So the goal of this phase, the pre-construction phase, is we have our signed contract, our baseline scope from the contract. We want to turn that into a project that's ready to deliver, which means we have a team to deliver it. Our budget is set up. Our schedule is set up. We've got systems set up. All our submittals and documents are approved. Our procurement's done. So our subcontractors, our paperwork's all ready to go when construction starts. Now, the first thing I'd like to do is to turn our estimate into a budget to do the work. An estimate and a budget are fundamentally different. An estimate is a calculation of the costs to complete the work. A budget is a way of tracking and monitoring how we spend it. Say, for example, you're pricing concrete structures. When you've actually gone through and prepared your estimate, you've likely made a small allowance for formwork against each of the structures. But in practice, when you deliver the project, the formwork budget is going to be a bucket of money used across all the structures. So this is now when you take all the individual cost items in the estimate and you need to transfer them into a systematic way to track them. So overheads, you would typically track by week or by duration. Maybe preliminary items like site setup would be a lump sum amount at the start of the job. Materials, I would always track as a bucket of money across the job, but then labor would typically be tracked per structure or per scope item. And then potentially subcontract costs, you would have one cost code per subcontract and so on and so forth. Really, it depends a lot on the specific scope of how you do it, but this is the format I like to do, where each budget item, you have a clear quantity that accurately reflects performance. And the budgets are broken down in a way that actually reflects how you're going to be spending money. You also want to have a good baseline schedule. Again, this should have been done in the pre-construction phase. So you have that baseline schedule in your contract. All the client milestones are in there. Everything you're relying on them is clearly articulated. During the pre-construction phase, you're likely just adding detail to this. The next thing you want to do is build your systems. So for me, this is taking the contract requirements and turning these into a big to-do list. All the different requirements we have to do to execute the project. For example, submitting SWIMs, getting paperwork approved. We basically want to take all these requirements and turn them into a big list. For example, we might have to get all our SWIMs approved at the start of the job and then to submit them and get them to reapproved monthly. Or for example, the monthly payment claim. When's that happening? Who's doing it? When a variation comes up, what is the exact process we follow? Most of these will be typical across projects where you've just got standard processes you follow that your business follows across projects, but really it's just about nailing them and having them all ready for your project. Now, importantly, as part of this, you need to assemble your team, and this relates to how you set up your systems. For every activity in your system, there should be somebody who is responsible to do that task. Now, I'm not an expert on human resources and hiring and all this stuff. I just have a simple philosophy that I want to work with people who fundamentally care about the success of the project. That is the number one trait I have consistently seen that makes great construction managers. Now, the next thing you want to do is you want to set up your document control system. I once had a manager say to me, and it's been something that just stuck in my mind that every year I realize is an increasingly relevant and important comment. Do you want to set up your document control? Now, this doesn't mean hiring a doc controller or using some sort of fancy software like TeamBinder. 90% of the benefits you'll get from it are from having a systemized, structured folder, not something like this, where you just have revisions of documents everywhere, subcontractor quotes, submissions, everything contradicts each other. Everything is confusing and messy. You just want a really rigid folder structure. This is the guide I use. I have a folder for project setup where you get all the contract admin, head contract kickoff meeting. I have a folder for planning and programming where you have all your schedule information, design drawings, procurement, contracts, and commercials. So that's all about the head contract. Then I have my estimate and cost control folder, site and construction, which is more about the actual site coordination, QA, obviously, safety, document control, which is where you store your drawings and document registers, correspondence, and project completion. So it's a very simple folder structure. You probably have something similar. Just formalize it and use the same template for every single project. Then when you're setting up a new project, all you do is copy the relevant project folder. The next thing you want to do is you need to finalize your procurement. So you need to sign up all the different trades and subcontractors who are going to be doing the work for you. You should have started this during the estimating and pre-construction phase where you got quotes from these subcontractors. Now, it really depends on the status of the design of what you were pricing off. If you were pricing off an issue for construction design, the transition from the pre-construction phase to the construction phase should be as simple as signing contracts. However, most projects price off a tender revision of the drawings with less detail, which means more or less you got budget or indicative pricing from subcontractors based on limited information. You'll have to basically go through and get them to reprice and check their prices. But really, the basis of their quotes, the basis of their original submission should be what went into your estimate. And if there are changes from what the pricing they provided you at tender to the pricing they provided you now, it should be covered by a head contract variation, because it should relate to something that's changed in the design if you did your procurement properly in the tendering phase. So for example, during the tendering phase, your electrical subcontractor had 2,500 meters of submains in their quote that was priced off a tender revision of the design. Now you move into the construction phase, you're getting them to reprice. You find the actual quantity of submains has gone up to 3,500 meters. That should automatically be a head contract variation, because assuming your client is providing you the design, you're not taking the design risk, that would become a variation. So really the key is that these quotes you got from your subcontractors, what you ended up including in your original estimate, should be very close to the pricing you're now getting during the construction phase, assuming you got your subcontractors to hold pricing and hold their validity. And then you can move into the construction phase very confident in the pricing you're going to be getting from your supply chain. The next major task, which again is going to be a huge part of the pre-construction phase, is getting all your paperwork and documentation ready and signed off. So these are your inspection test plans, your safe work method statements. If you're doing any sort of procurement, your shop drawings for your suppliers or any design you're doing, everything needs to be 100% ready and approved. I like to have some sort of big document register with the status of all these documents, then track the date it was submitted, the date it was approved by the client. Now, typically in the contract, it will specify something like your client has 10 days to review and approve RFIs. That is why you should be tracking the date you're submitting this to your client and the date they're approving it. Because if they're late in approving documentation, theoretically, again, if you can show that the approval of that documentation was on the critical path of your schedule, you can show that delays the start date of your works, you would be entitled to claim an extension of time. Now, I'm not saying you necessarily will, but it's always good to have the commercial option available. And the other thing, which sounds like a weird thing to discuss in the pre-construction phase, but you should start thinking about how you're going to hand over the project at the end. I can't express how essential this is to start thinking about now. And really, it's not like you have to put a lot of time into it. You just have to understand fundamentally what you need to do to hand over the project at the end of the job. The format I like to do this in is a requirements register. So a requirements register is effectively where you list out every single requirement in the head contract that you have to do to hand over to submit your final payment claim, such as the O&M manuals, warranty certificates, handover training, all these things, they're listed out. Someone is responsible for doing that. There's a due date and a status. And when you submit that to your client, you track the day it was submitted. Basically, pre-construction, I think of the output of this stage is being 100% ready to start the construction works. Everything's signed off. Everything is 100% ready to go. If we think of this in terms of a construction S-curve, where are we? So we are at this point in the time of period. We've started to spend some money on our overheads, but we're yet to hit that construction phase where we're spending huge amount of money. We're pouring concrete, standing steel. That's what's coming. But if you think about it, what is coming is a tidal wave of expenditure. So we need to be 100% ready. Again, on our cost and influence curve, we're still early on in the piece. We can still make some big impacts on the project outcomes with some small decisions. So there's a lot of control we have over the outcomes. We need to be 110% ready for these huge expenditures that are coming up. So we're spending money efficiently and effectively. In addition, we're putting more time and effort into planning the project. So uncertainty is decreasing. We're finding things out. Risk is unveiling. We have client commitments. We can start billing them for our early mobilization and work we're doing on the project. But really, it's just we have to think about getting everything 100% ready to go before we hit these huge expenditures. Now we hit the construction phase where we actually begin to do the works. We're getting money flowing in from our payment claims to the client, but we're also spending a huge amount of money. We're pouring concrete. We've got big machinery on site, excavating. We're pulling in cables. We're billing our client for the work we're doing. We're we also need to check what we're doing is correct. We're going to have some amount of retention held back from every payment claims, but really the big risk here is that we do additional work that we didn't budget for through scope creep and through poorly administrating the contract. We get into disputes with our client, they delay paying us, we run into cash flow crises, and we don't manage the work sufficiently, so we're spending more money than we needed to. So if we break this down into the inputs and outputs of the phase, we've got a project that's ready to deliver, a team assembled, budget set, the schedule locked, our systems running, procurement done, and documentation approved. That was the output of the last stage. Now the output of this stage is going to be, ideally, a project delivered on time, under budget, nobody is hurt, and a client who is begging us to come back and do their next project. To me, construction is where you really should have, you will have the most chaos, but it's where you should have the least decisions to make. Sure, you may be reacting to things that are happening, but really all the important decisions around the project should have already been made. The construction phase is very much about following the plan you set. You also need to track progress. So there's following the plan, which is our baseline schedule, but then we're also using tools like earned value management. We're tracking what is actually happening. How are we performing compared to the plan? We need to be tracking our actual cost versus our earned value and all these sorts of things. Now, I've done videos on earned value. It's a relatively easy concept to understand, project controls, but really the big thing I see is people don't actually do it. So like they have a baseline schedule, they have a budget, but they never update this stuff. The concepts are really easy, but it becomes very messy if you don't actually follow and track what you said you were going to track. Now, again, the only reason that you do this, you don't do it just because having graphs like this is nice. You do it to correct deviations. When there is variance from the baseline, you have to work out and understand why. So when you deviate from the plan, you then fix it. Deviations from the plan may be your fault. Maybe you made incorrect assumptions at tender. Maybe you have not managed the work efficiently. Those, you just have to grit your teeth and fix the changes. But a lot of the time, the change will be as a result of things the client have done. Situations where we would have entitlements to claim additional money and time because they have changed the scope. That's the situation we need to go through the variation process. So, variations you can fit into two separate categories. You can have a variation proposed by the client. These are easy. Your client is asking you to do additional work. You agree that there is a difference in scope from what was originally intended because your client is in fact asking you. So all you have to do is price the variation. So the disagreement here is most likely, not most likely, can only be about the change in scope. You can also have a variation claim. This is where your client has been delayed in giving you access to site, and you tell your client, we think this is a variation to the original contract, and we want additional time and money. These are more complicated because you can have two potential changes to scope. So you can have two potential things you disagree on. You can disagree on the existence of the variation, then you can also disagree on the cost. So the trick with getting these approved is to independently complete each step. Prove the variation exists, and then price it. But don't try and do both in the same step, because if your client sees some huge variation, they're going to push back harder on the fact that it exists. So always prove the variation exists, get agreement on it, and before you move forward, get that approved, and then move on to the pricing. Now, your ability to get variations, to claim variations, is always going to come back to your ability to have a crystal clear scope definition. The more explicit the scope of works is, the easier it is to prove that something has changed. Now, to provide context this entire process, yes, you want to claim variations. Yes, you want to claim your entitlements. But again, you have to keep your client happy. Construction companies become big and successful through repeat business from their clients. That is the only way contractors can grow, by keeping their clients happy. I'm not saying you should always do this. I'm not saying you shouldn't claim variations. You just have to keep in the back of your mind, a happy client will give you repeat work. So beating them up over tiny variations, claiming absolutely everything you can, is probably going to be counterintuitive for the success of your business in the long run. In terms of our S-curve, where are we? We are in the middle of the construction phase. We're spending all our money. This is probably going to be the most chaotic, This is where chaos is really going to start to compound, where we're going to start to get into the realm of fighting fires and dealing with things we didn't plan or prepare for properly. But really, if we have set up the project properly in the pre-construction phase, it should hopefully be as simple as just executing the plan we established. Fundamentally, the construction phase isn't or shouldn't be about creativity. You will need some creativity to solve problems as they come up, but fundamentally it's going to be much more about discipline. What are you actually doing versus what did you plan to do? The final phase of the project is closeout. This is where we want to finish the work, hand it over to our client, get our practical completion certificate, submit our final payment claim, and move on to the next project. Ideally, this is also where our client is ecstatic, they're happy at our performance, and they're offering us to come back and do the next project. Our input is a delivered project, so something we've completed during the construction phase. The output of this phase is the final payment claim, the fulfilled contract obligations. So obviously, to get into this phase, we actually have to finish the work. We have to complete the construction as specified in the drawings. The next thing we need to do is we need to do all our QA and inspections. We need to complete our quality assurance, complete all our inspection and test plans and checklists, basically verify and validate that what the drawings show is what we've built. We then also want to work through our handover register. So I discussed this before, but this is our register of every single requirement in the contract, what we have to do to close it out, the due date, the status, everything. We want to get all this paperwork in and verify against the contract requirements and prove unequivocally that everything the contract said we needed to do to hand over the project, we have done. Once we have completed everything, we can submit our practical completion application. We'll have to show any outstanding defects we've got. We've got to prove that they don't impair the operation of the asset. We work through this with the client. We get them to accept that everything we've said we were going to do, we have in fact done. Then they'll let us submit our final payment claim and the defects liability period will start. The defects liability period is a period nominated in the contract where we are responsible for coming back and rectifying defects. It's anywhere between 12 to 36 months, but something to be aware of here is you can get some of your security back at the original practical completion, but the rest of your security you will only be able to get back at the end of the DLP. Now, the final thing here is you want to keep your client happy through this entire process. You want to make sure they are satisfied with how you've delivered the project. You've been professional and easy to work with. Something to be aware of is if you look at the value of construction companies, so this is typically done looking at different industries by EBITDA, which is very similar to profit, and a multiple of the EBITDA. You can see software companies typically sell for something like an EBITDA of 6. Construction companies typically sell for 2.5 to 3.5. The reason for this difference is because construction is lumpy project-based work in a competitive environment. What actually pushes up the value of a construction company is recurring revenue. Now, recurring revenue doesn't necessarily mean doing maintenance work. It can be clients coming back and giving you more projects to bid for. The only reason you will get that is if your clients are happy with your work. So ultimately, a happy client is a repeat customer, which is where you are going to really build a big and sustainable construction business.